Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to more Conversations in the Digital Age. Our conversation today is about New York City's historic landmarks. When in 1964 they demolished the 52-year-old Pennsylvania Station, a beautiful Beaux-Arts structure designed by the renowned architectural firm of McKim, Mead and White, and replaced it with the ugly Madison Square Garden complex sitting above a decaying train station, there was a public outcry. Adding insult to injury in 1967, developers took the wrecking ball to the old Metropolitan Opera House, which had been standing for over 80 years. Picking up a fallen standard, New York preservationists promptly swung into action. With us is a leading preservationist who spearheaded the movement to landmark New York City, Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel, chair of the New York State Council on the Arts. Barbaralee is a landmarks pioneer and a sensitive urbanist, and has been for many years a force of nature behind the preservation movement. She's just brought out the 6th edition of her fascinating book called The Landmarks of New York, an illustrated comprehensive record of New York City's historic buildings, illustrating the 1,352 individual landmarks and 139 districts that have been accorded landmark status by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. The book is a marvelous resource for those seeking a thorough understanding of New York's architectural and cultural heritage. Barbaralee, we're delighted to have you with us.
Well, I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for that very generous introduction.
Well, please tell us about your book. I congratulate you on it. It's the 6th edition. Why is this book, with over 900 pages, different from all the other books that preceded it?
Well, when I wrote the first book in 1988, there were 800 individual landmarks, 52 historic districts, 70 interior landmarks, and 9 scenic landmarks that totaled approximately 16,000 buildings. Even since the last edition in 2011, 5 years ago, there are more than 100 new individually designated landmarks, and perhaps of even greater importance, the designation of 30 very important new historic districts that more and more become the heart of the landmarks movement. Those 100 districts represent a 30% increase in all of these designations.
Well, what makes a landmark a landmark?
It's a fair question. Among other things, of course, architectural distinction. But the entire field in New York City, not the first of landmarks commissions, which was founded in 1965, but surely the leading one in the United States. It's the bellwether of everything in terms of both the quality and number of designations. Since then, it has emerged from a movement that was generally thought of as the province of cliched women in floppy old hats. It is now a very central object of central concern to all citizens. It must have architectural distinction, but since then, we've moved to think, particularly in the most recent period, of other reasons. Not only the facade of the building, but what went on under those roofs. So, for example, in the most...
So you mean the history of the building?
The history of the building is part of the architecture, but the history of what went on there. Who lived where and when, and what did they do? What did they create or invent or move forward under that roof? And it is an amazing story that makes New York, New York. You know, there's a recent exhibit that describes 4 factors that makes New York, New York. And I've pondered, after their 5 years of deliberation, what they came up with. 4 points. One was finance. At its very beginnings, the Dutch East India Companies was at the heart of everything. It was all about money. And it still has a great deal to do with money. The second was the density. And it still has enormous density. We're about 8.7, 8.8 million people now, moving toward 9 million. And we've got to start thinking of ways to move people around, to house and educate them in reasonable ways as this population increase continues and that New York continues, which we all want it to, as the magnet for talented people all over the world.
Now,
But I wanted to say 2 other things there. It was density, diversity. It's an intriguing city. There are places in Queens that speak 138 languages in one little community, and they all live very happily together. And the last point was creativity. And I think that it is the root of what makes New York go. The kind of energetic juices that you really don't see flowing in such profusion in many parts of the world. There are lots of other cultural centers, but all of this going on in one place makes us the vibrant kind of city that it is.
now you have in this marvelous book, where the landmarks are presented in chronological order. You start with the Peter Clayson Wyckoff House from 1652, which is the wood frame building. It's not particularly interesting or distinctive, at least in my view, but it is the oldest standing building in New York State. So an aspect of landmarking would be the age of the structure and what it represents in our cultural history.
But it is
Is that fair?
interesting as well, I think, and thank you for reading the book. The Wyckoffs, there may be tens of thousands of them now, I think might disagree with you because they still meet as a family. It's an perfect example of how people lived in 1652. There's a very modest house in Queens, in Flushing, which was a Dutch village then called Vlissingen. And the building is the John Bown House. It's fair to say it's one of my favorites.
Mine
Not
too,
be-
1661.
Very good.
Yes.
Why do you like it?
Well, I like it really because of its history, because it's identified with the Quakers, isn't it, and their struggle for religious freedom. So why don't you tell us a little about that?
Well,
All that's in the book, by the way.
the reason it is organized chronologically, I pondered that carefully, is because as the book unfolds, so does the history of New York. Not only in terms of architectural styles, but industrial revolutions, diversity, immigrants, all the things that churn about that make the city. So this house, the John Bown, B-O-W-N-E, house in Flushing, Queens, was owned by a man who was a Quaker. The then governor of New York, the irascible Peter Stuyvesant, thought Quakers were an abominable sect, and he said so. And they gathered together to meet in the living room of John Bown's house, this simple wood frame structure that has just undergone a restoration, and it's really worth a visit because now they're putting back together some of the original pieces in the house. But what's more important than its date is what John Bown did. Peter Stuyvesant told him he could not practice his religion there. And like any good real estate development,
Told Bown he couldn't practice his religion.
Yep. The Dutch East India Company said, come to this new country, you'll have a house, you'll do what you want, you'll have freedom of religion, you'll have freedom to practice whatever you want. And John Bown believed that. So he continued to invite people into his house. They continued to meet. Peter Stuyvesant continued to tell him, if you do that, I will deport you. He continued to do it, and guess what? He was deported back to Holland in the 1660s. Just think what it's like to go even on a shuttle now. Well, he went back by ship to Holland, fought his own case, and as a lawyer, you know what that generally means, but he won because he was quite justified. When he came back...
Of course, this was before the Constitution, so there was no free exercise clause, and I think it's many hundreds of years later that the Supreme Court held you can't deport people to punish them, although the president-elect seems to think you can.
I think I'll start to interview you about that as an expert on the Constitution.
Well, but
it is very interesting. What else occurred was a document called the Flushing Remonstrance, and it's part of the New York State Archives in Albany, and it's often celebrated because that little document that says you're free to practice your religion, we're free to accept blacks, Jews, and other slaves, I think, made the beginning of what our country was about, let alone New York. What makes it so exciting, that document, the Flushing Remonstrance, was later codified in our Bill of Rights to practice freedom of religion. That little simple wood frame house. Every place and everybody has a story, but some are more interesting than others.
Yes. And so we have what went on there, we have age, we have architecture, and that's what goes into something being a landmark. Now, New York was quite late to the landmark movement, wasn't it?
Not quite late, but...
Well, we're talking 1964. And
well, that's when the law was passed. But before that, there was, you know, the Ladies' Societies of Mount Vernon in Virginia, various preservation activities. But Mayor Wagner, I think originally because of the pressure of the Metropolitan Opera House first, many of his friends were on that board. It wasn't a distinguished building, but it had outstanding acoustics.
A lot went on there.
Yep.
It was the room where it happened.
In any case, they spoke to their friend, and then a citizens movement, more and more, continued to grow. That's what's so wonderful about landmarks. 140 districts, 35,000 buildings, some of the most valuable and interesting properties in the world, but all of it galvanized and moved forward by a grassroots citizens movement, regardless age, color, socioeconomic background. Many of the nominations, much of the information comes from the neighborhood. Drive through New York. We are a changed city from river to river. You know, each of the 5 boroughs have many, many distinguished landmarks, and the mixture of the old and the new is what makes it such an interesting place.
Now, once a building is landmarked, can it legally be torn down the way Penn Station was, or the way the old Metropolitan Opera House was?
The designation of a building does not freeze it. If there are appropriate designations, you don't want it painted yellow and orange and purple, but there are certain laws. We are a country of private property rights, which I respect, and I assume you respect, but there is a common good and the public good, and there are certain laws that one should respect. For example, there are now historic district street signs on every single street corner that has, and it contains a historic district, terracotta black and white signs that identifies across the top that this is an historic district. You live in a historic district, so do I, and so do many, many of your viewers.
So the theater district is an historic district.
It certainly is, and that was a case where theater owners were very activist eventually, Jerry Schoenfeld especially, in working to designate those theaters. We lost some, but people come to New York for our theaters, for our culture, for our architecture, for our performing literary and visual arts. As it's not only visitors, but residents also take pride and enjoyment because it's at every price range as well, and lots of free opportunities to view things. It's made a big difference with theaters.
Now, you still didn't answer my question.
Which one?
You tear down a landmark building?
You can't.
You can't. That's not permissible.
Well, there is no solid, you never know what the circumstances are. But the point is, you can make every kind of adjustment if it doesn't so significantly alter or destroy the historical fabric. If you look through the book, one of the things that I did was review everything from 1965 to the present and update it to say the changes, rooftop additions, window fenestration, all kinds of things that have been done to buildings, but that conform to a kind of architectural excellence.
And to qualify as a landmark, a building has to be 30 years old, at least. Isn't that right?
Yep.
So theoretically, every year,
Yes.
there should be more
That is
buildings
correct.
eligible for landmarking.
Yes.
How many do you landmark every year?
Well, there's no fixed number. And I think one of the reasons that the portfolio is expanding to include other qualifications is because it's not that there is a finite number of landmark. Everything can't be landmarked, but there are many things that should be saved. I think that it's not coincidental that the preservation movement evolved side by side with the civil rights, human rights, women's rights, LGBTQ, and other progressive movements, all during these past 50 years. All of these forces, including preservation, share a philosophical commitment to the public good and the public welfare, and our responsibility to each other that some things should last longer in our own lifetimes.
Now, for example, you have, I think one of the landmark buildings is the Alexander Hamilton Customs House, the Battery. Now, that's used as a federal bankruptcy court. It's no longer a customs house. It's a marvelous building. So you can change the use of a landmark building, can't you?
Oh, yes. In fact, the Custom House was the home of the Museum of the American Indian, and many buildings changed their use. There was a book that I wrote a number of years ago that focused on adaptive reuse, a term not used really before that.
You have one building that was an old synagogue on Pike Street and became a Buddhist temple. Is that an example of adaptive reuse?
It certainly is, but we have another building downtown that was at one time a very fine single-family dwelling, and then it became an OTB headquarters, and now it's evolved to something else.
Then the old synagogue was from 1903, and yet now I think it's both residential space and retail space and a Buddhist temple.
Well, that's happened throughout the country. In fact, the Landmarks Conservancy, one of the private sector organizations that I'm pleased to say I was a founding member of, has an extraordinary program that most people know about called Sacred Sites. Many houses of worship of every denomination were often downtown, where populations moved to suburbs, to other places, and those buildings have been repurposed. Obviously, the best use of a building is its original use, but not always. There are multi-purpose uses for buildings. New York is a movable feast. It's a very dynamic city, and real estate forces have always played a very prominent role in it. And there is some kind of natural tension that I think is exaggerated, mostly in the heat of the moment of development, by real estate forces between a preservation movement and real estate. All preservationists are interested in new, good architecture. It's that mixed fabric is what makes a city interesting. I commented recently, there was a full-page ad in the New York Times, a costly investment for a daily paper, but it makes a point. I don't know if you recall back in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a very contentious fight going on about the Villard houses.
On Madison Avenue.
Henry Villard, yes, was a famous publisher, a rather distinguished family, the whole block front on Madison and 50th Street. That block front was saved by the Municipal Art Society, the then leading organization to save structures, as its home. But there was a lot behind it. A very hectic fight ensued with some of our best and most respected lawyers suing landmarks commissioners individually, myself included. It was not a happy circumstance, and it really wasn't a valid case. In fact, it went to many, many courts, and it was proved that it wasn't a valid case. So a hotel was built right behind the block front facade, and you may remember it as the Palace Hotel.
Yes.
It's now a Lotte, a Korean company, owning it, but the Lotte Hotel went up right behind it, and the facade and those buildings were saved, and it was an entrance to the hotel.
It was the Helmsley Palace Hotel where the Queen stands guard. Leona Helmsley was really the symbol of the palace.
And the enemy was the Landmarks Commission. But soon as the building opened, it was advertised, come to our Landmarks Hotel. I noticed about a week or so ago a full-page ad in the New York Times, the latest controversy about the beautiful Mies van der Rohe's Searoom building, and a landmark within the landmark building, the Four Seasons restaurant, designed by the venerable Philip Johnson.
Now closed.
Being renovated for a new restaurant by the owner of the building. The old owners took their Four Seasons name and will open a new restaurant called the Four Seasons on 48th Street and Park Avenue, and it's under construction now. And the current owner of the building, who fought long and hard to rest those rooms, because it was a very lively lunch spot, the home of the so-called power lunch, whatever that means. And inside there is a beautiful pool room.
Good food.
And good food and excellent service. And a beautiful pool room, and beautifully designed. Well, the former owners sold recently at auction all of the interior designs, and they're rebuilding their new Four Seasons at Park and Madison. That's Julian and Alex. The owner of the building, A.B. Rosen, is taking over the restaurant, but after all those lawsuits, can you guess what it is being called?
Please tell us.
The Landmarks Rooms.
Oh, marvelous. Marvelous. Will the pool remain?
The pool room remains because it's designated.
Yes.
And one is the grill room and one is the bar room.
Well, good for you. You saved the pool.
More than the pool, a beautiful interior space. One of the loveliest spaces in New York City, and we wish them both well.
Yes. Now, we're rapidly running out of time because this has been wonderful, but I'd like you to just quickly tell us something about the Cultural Medallion Program, which is a feature of the Landmarks movement.
Actually, it's a feature of the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center. I was the longest term serving commissioner on the Landmarks Commission for 17 years. I often wonder, what was I thinking? But afterwards, I became the head of the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center, and one of its programs are cultural medallions, beautiful terracotta black and white oval medallions, the concept based on London's Blue Marker program. But they say Disraeli lived here. We tried to give the unexpurgated version.
We used to say George Washington slept here, but now you're telling us a lot more on each medallion, isn't that right?
Running out of space, but we want people to stop and say, I didn't know that. And the next one that we're planning is, would you believe, the centennial of Leonard Bernstein's birth, occurs in 2017, and that will be the next one at the Osborne, an individually designated landmark where Leonard Bernstein and his family lived and worked and wrote many things.
Yes, I thought it was so interesting that one of the medallions is the home on Fifth Avenue of Marian Anderson, who, of course, sang at the Lincoln Memorial in a historic performance in 1939 because she was banned because she was black from singing in the Constitutional Hall, and she sang "My Country 'Tis of Thee" at the Lincoln Memorial.
On the steps.
On the steps, and it was a marvelous occasion. So you revive all these great moments in our history.
Yes, to remind people
with the medallion
that these struggles that eventually we hope have happier endings than the moment they took place.
Yes, indeed. So I have to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Is landmarking good for New York City?
Wonderful.
Wonderful for New York City. Thank you so much for coming by. This
Well,
has been
thank you
just
for
marvelous.
asking me.
And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more Conversations in the Digital Age. I'm Jim Zirin. All the best and take care.